Today, I'm going to be talking about something closer to literary studies, namely translation, but trying to push around a little bit the definition of translation through some examples. Now, translation is one of the favorite metaphors of our time. People ask how a slogan is supposed to translate into reality, or they might ask how to translate a certain kind of moral universe into political terms. My university boasts an Institute of Translational Medicine, which is not a place where they inject a chemical into your brain that enables you to speak a different language. That would be nice, but it doesn't happen. Rather, the task of this Institute of Translational Medicine is to speed up the practical application of biological discoveries, and so on. Anyway, the word translation is used a great deal for operations that have little to do with translating among languages. It's just a favored figure of speech. The use of the word translate here is more of an unsecured promise that these mediations will occur in the same way and with the same regularity that interlinguistic translation occurs. Closer to my concern, and to literal translation of words and sentences, it is often suggested that translation is the real subject of comparative literature. That seems plausible, because very often we're looking at ways to make works from different traditions compatible or analogous so that we can apply a lesson learned from reading Shakespeare to reading an author from some other tradition, right? So in that way, the idea of translation as a kind of a common conceptual denominator seems very plausible for comparative literature. And of course, quite simply and literally, a lot of the time we are dealing with problems in literal translation of words and sentences. So to sum up, translation takes up a great deal of space in the world of words today. But not all the space, for like everything, it has an other. And it's this other thing, non-translation, that I would like to investigate. But non-translation comes in several different flavors. Today, I don't mean to talk about the realm of untranslated works, because those works could always find a translator. Nor do I intend to make a claim that is sometimes heard that we can't or shouldn't translate, or that certain people should refrain from translating. Some hold certain texts to be so holy that translation would defile them. Poetry, Robert Frost is reported to have said, is what is lost in translation. And maybe that's a good thing. Prasenjit Gupta contends that the asymmetries in wealth, power, authority, and receivability are fatal to the project of translation between third world authors and first world audiences, so that if contemporary Indian writers were translated into English, say, that would never be a real translation, according to Gupta. Very suggestive and difficult idea. The claim is also often made that certain words in a language are untranslatable, by which is usually meant not translatable by a single word in English. The meanings appear to be paraphrasable enough. Right? You might say, there's no word in English for schadenfreude, right? But everybody knows what schadenfreude is because somebody has explained it to you. All these cases, though, these cases of non-translatability, amount to a single kind of claim. These traditional negatives of translation, what cannot be translated or must not be translated, are not the other I mean to explore. The other I have in mind is vanishingly close to translation, so much so that it is often mistaken for translation, as it happens usually at close quarters to translation and achieves more or less the same ends. To see this other, we have to examine translation, but to look askance, to look away from the specific operation that translation, in the most classic formulations of that term, performs. This kind of non-translation calls on resources different from those of translation. It has its distinct effects. It makes us do different things and engage with bits of the world in a different way. In fact, I've just done this kind of non-translation by telling you that in English we use the word schadenfreude to mean schadenfreude. Right? Rather than giving you a translation of the word, I've simply interjected the German word into my English sentence. Well, let's turn back to translation. What is translation? It's what happens when the meaning of a sequence in language A is reproduced or transferred or made to happen again under the forms of a sequence in language B. Controversies about translation are usually a matter of the accuracy of the reproduction. Thus, it is possible for Emily Apter to say quite accurately and without contradiction that nothing is translatable and everything is translatable. Nothing is translatable if you're looking for a perfect translation. Everything is translatable in the sense that nothing is exempt from the possibility of being translated more or less completely, more or less well. But consider the following example. In an early chapter of James Joyce's Ulysses, the character Stephen Dedalus is remembering his brief period as a student in Paris. You see, I can't get away from Paris. The stream of consciousness narration takes us into his thoughts. Paris rawly waking, crude sunlight on her lemon streets, moist pith of farls of bread, the frog-green wormwood, her matin incense court the air. Bell'uomo rises from the bed of his wife's lover's wife. The kerchiefed housewife is astir, a saucer of acetic acid in her hands. In Rodot's, Yvonne and Madeleine new make their tumbled beauties, shattering with gold teeth chaussons of pastry, their mouths yellowed with the pus of flan breton. Faces of Paris men go by, their well-pleased pleasers, curled conquistadors. Now, the technique of showing Stephen's thoughts does not have to respect the difference between English and French. For when he thinks about Paris, it is natural that just as the images, flavors, and associations of the left bank come to his mind, so do the French names for these things. It would not do to replace chausson with turnover and flan breton with custard, because the English foodstuffs are not made in the same way as the French ones and do not have the same taste or texture. The power of the memory, the Proustian memory, we could legitimately say, would be lost in such a translation. Now, in the French version of Ulysses, translated by two close associates of Joyce, we find Paris s'éveille débraillé, une lumière crue dans ses rues citron. La pulpe moite des croissants fumants, l'absinthe couleur de rainette, son encens matinal flatte l'atmosphère. Bell'uomo quitte le lit de la femme de l'amant de sa femme. La ménagère s'ébranle, un mouchoir sur la tête, une soucoupe d'acide acétique à la main. Chez Rodot, Yvonne et Madeleine refont leur beauté fripée. Dents horrifiées qui broient des chaussons, bouche jaunie par le puce du flan breton. Des visages de Parisiens passent, leurs charmeurs charmés, conquistadors au petit fer. In the so-called English text, Joyce had written chausson and flan breton. And the translator has apparently given up on translating them, for they appear simply as chausson and flan breton. Those words are untranslatable into French. How could that be? What is impossible to render into French is the effect of foreignness that those two French expressions had when appearing in the middle of a paragraph of English prose. The only way to reproduce that would have been to insert their equivalents in Italian, say, or Spanish or German or Chinese, but that would involve reworking the setting of the whole episode to a degree that would not normally be permitted a translator, right? You could imagine that the French Stephen Dedalus is a Parisian who goes to study in Italy and has to eat Italian food and so on. That would just be too much. When foreign words appear in a text, they make it macaronic. That's the technical term. They make it a patchwork, a hybrid, a graft. The act being performed by the macaronic writer is not one of translation, but of transcription, inscription or imposition, much as if the writer were simply inventing a new word. There's a medieval term for this in Latin, impositio nominum, the putting of names. The newness of this kind of inscription contrasts with the conventional understanding of translation, which seeks to find a correlation between the already existing terms of two languages. There is a familiar and classic essay by the logician Willard Van Orman Quine, attempting to show that translation is indeterminate and therefore never reliably successful. You may know this essay. It yields, though, an unintentional example of transcription, which I am contending is not translation, is in fact non-translation. Here's how the example goes. Quine imagines a linguist out in the field with a native informant at his side. A rabbit appears, and the native speaker remarks, "Gavagai." Now, what is the linguist to make of this? Is Gavagai the word for rabbit in the as yet undeciphered foreign language? Are we sure that we are not overinterpreting? Could Gavagai be the name for something that does not have a name in English? Something like undetached rabbit parts, or time slices of rabbitry, or particular kinds of event to which a rabbit sighting is a contributory but not the defining element. It would not be unreasonable, by way of comparison, for a beginner to think that bless you was the word for sneezing in English, rather than a ritualistic utterance with which we greet a sneeze. With such considerations, Quine wants to rob us of our innocent assumption that words designate objects and that different languages simply use different words to indicate the same objects. He seeks to make us concede the difficulty, the unlikelihood of translation, right? That was his intention in using the Gavagai example, to make us no longer believe in the reliability of the equivalences of translation. But here's where I come in and try to reorient the discussion a little bit, or to shift it. Because Gavagai has, in the 50 years since Quine published his article, come to have a meaning in English. It was invented as a deliberately inscrutable term. But by now, even among people with scanty logical training like myself, the Gavagai example is recognizable without further introduction, an old friend from the exhibit room of philosophical problems. If you go to the American Philosophical Association, I'm sure you can walk into any room and say Gavagai, and everybody will know what you're talking about. People say, where's the rabbit? But is this acquired familiarity with the made-up word Gavagai a case of translation? Of course not. Because, for one thing, there was never a previous language from which translating could have been done. And if translating is a transfer of meaning across differences in linguistic form, it will fail this test as well. For whatever it may mean, the form, in English and all other languages in which I've seen this argument cited, remains the same, Gavagai. Even the Gavagai Cafe, a business establishment in Taiwan, uses the familiar Roman letters to write its name. The word repeats rather than being interpreted, and repetition does not usually count as interpretation. Some parts of language we expect to go without translation. Proper names, for example. The proper name, as a consequence of its proper status, its status as a thing that's owned or that belongs to someone, transliterates and does not translate. A nonce word like Gavagai behaves similarly. It sends us back to the first instance of utterance. If I were to ask you what the word for Gavagai is in Russian or Portuguese or any other language in which Quine's problem of indeterminacy has been discussed, you could truthfully answer Gavagai, though you would not be answering any question about translation in saying so. One person who answers my kind of question about translation is the poet Hugh MacDiarmid. I understand him only about half the time, but hear him in a poem called Garm Scylla. And I don't know if anyone here reads Scots. Does anyone know Scots? I personally don't, but so forgive me for my attempt to give a voice to this poem. Hee-haw, click-clack, and cock-a-doodle-doo. Will Gabriel in Esperanto cry, or the world's undemist jargons try? It's soon no sense that fathoms the hearts of men, and by my sangs the roch old Scots I ken, een hearts that hae no Scots, il dear rich throw as nocht else could. For here's a language rings with datchy sesames and names for nameless things. Okay. Roughly what he's saying is, hee-haw, click-clack, and cock-a-doodle-doo. You got that part, right? Sort of sound transcriptions of animal noises. Will Gabriel, that is the angel at the last judgment, right, blowing the trumpet, will Gabriel shout in Esperanto, because he has to summon all the dead to come out of the ground and return to life, Or will he try all the world's incompatible jargons? It is sound, not sense, that reaches to the bottom of the hearts of men. And in my songs, I know the rough old Scots language. Even hearts that don't put, or minds, right? Even hearts and minds that have no Scots will pierce right through as nothing else could. So he's making a claim that Scots is this universal language that speaks directly to your heart because it works by sound and not by sense. And he says, for here is a language that rings with clever sesames, like open sesame, and names for nameless things. Now, this is tremendous. And as I say, I don't really read Scots, but you can kind of piece it together. And in fact, McDermott, although he wrote mostly in Scots, was not a native speaker of Scots. He was a native speaker of English who kind of synthesized a version of Scots in which he wrote his poetry. And the way that he uses Scots has always been a little bit controversial among, say, authentic Gaelic speakers. Right? But he's trying to do something that's actually macaronic, mixing up not only Scots and English, but as you can see, animal sounds, Hebrew, Gabriel, French, jargon, right? Sesame, which comes to us through the story of Aladdin in the Arabian Nights, right? So it's a very macaronic poem, and that's one of the things that helps us get through it. So part of what McDermott does in writing this poem is translating. He's doing a little bit of translating. But a great deal more is cutting and pasting, fashioning his patchwork of Scots and English into a language encompassing the past, the future, the human, the animal, and the ghostly worlds. So not everything translates, but not everything has to translate. Translation is not the necessary channel for every kind of communicative exchange. How big is the territory of exceptions to the rule of translation? Quine mentions cases in which it's easy to ignore the problem of translation, cases where the uncertainties are taken care of for us. For example, when two languages are so closely related that finding equivalence is almost automatic, right? So often French and English use essentially the same word, right? The train and le train. You don't waste a lot of time wondering what the French word for train is if you know that it's le train. Or else you might have languages that are historically unrelated, like, say, English and Hungarian, but they have in their backgrounds lots of shared cultural history and institutions that make it possible to find the same things being spoken of with different words, right? If you wanted to say, I don't know, the Archbishop ate breakfast in Hungarian, you could do that in the knowledge that Hungarians, having experienced some of the same things that English speakers have experienced, know what an archbishop is, and they have the habit of eating something that's analogous to breakfast and so on, right? Whereas you wouldn't necessarily be able to say that if you were trying to translate it into 5th century BC Chinese, for example, right? All, meals, institutions, everything would have to be thought up from the ground. So Quine is not much interested in these cases where there's a lot of common knowledge, a lot of commonality between the language, for, as he says, it is the discontinuity of radical translation that tries our meanings. Radical translation, that is, translation that's unprepared for by a shared history. Those meanings are most visibly put to the test when the sentences to be translated across a radical cultural gap are, I'm quoting now, extremely theoretical. Thus, who would undertake to translate neutrinos lack mass into the jungle language? I forgot to say that the language in which Gavagai occurs, he calls the jungle language. A little bit embarrassing. But he was writing in the 1950s when that was permissible humor. If anyone does, Quine continues, if anyone does, we may expect him to coin words or distort the usage of old ones. We may expect him to plead in extenuation that the natives lack the requisite concepts, also that they know too little physics. All right, so how do you say neutrinos lack mass in a language that's spoken by some people who live in the woods and observe rabbits? Well, the more theoretical the content of what is to be transmitted, the more obviously it depends on a complex built-up structure and network of related words, activities, machines, and other theories, which must be somehow accounted for if we are to get the meaning of the theoretical statement across. Right? To say what a neutrino is in that language, you have to have a lot of previous knowledge that would enable you to get to that word and concept. Quine's genius was to see that it is always the case that our terms repose on a vast implicit body of theories. His genius was to see that that's always the case, although we're not always conscious of it. It's easier to call attention to rabbits than to neutrinos. Importing into what Quine calls, to our embarrassment, the jungle language, the whole conceptual apparatus of subatomic physics seems a bizarre mission, something that Quine mentions only to awaken our sense of absurdity. Rather than translate the whole language of physics, wouldn't it be easier to teach one of the natives English or German or Russian and then move on to teaching them physics in that language? That calculus of benefit blocks us from noticing the interesting thing about translating the physics textbook into the language of the forest dwellers, namely the compulsion to, as Quine puts it, coin words or distort the usage of old ones. The act of translating would do violence to the language in which translation is being done, if it has to transmit a lot of brand new content. Quine does not stop to look into that violence, that twisting and turning, but we should, if we are to discover what lies just askance of translation. Askance, that's a funny word. It's a word in English, and I think I know English, but this is a word for the use of which I don't have a clear rule. I know how to use it. I can say that theorists of translations look askance at Quine. But just what kind of relation askance denotes is a little vaguer in my mind. As so often happens, I have only one language, and it's not mine, to quote Mr. Derrida. Trying to lay a firmer hand on the English language, I turned to the Oxford English Dictionary, where I learned that askance is probably an imported word, but no one is sure from where. Although fossilized and appearing now only in the set expression to look askance at something, i.e. to look on it with disapproval, loathing, or contempt, the word had from the 15th to 18th centuries the meaning sidewise, oblique, askew, or asquint. The dictionary makes a few citations from Milton in Paradise Lost. And I think it's a wonderful set of citations because in these three quotations, you get the whole story of Paradise Lost by these occurrences of askance. Right? In book 4, the devil with jealous leer malign eyed them askance. In book 6, whom the grand foe with scornful eye askance thus answered. Right, so there you got the combats in heaven. And book 10, he bid his angels turn askance the poles of earth. Right, so it's too late. They ate the apple. The earth has been turned off its axis. Now there are going to be seasons and problems and so on. Right, so askance will take you through the whole poem. As for the etymology, it is unknown. The Oxford lexicographers go to town on this word. Here's what they have to say. Wedgwood suggests Italian asciancio, bias, slanting, sloping or slopingly, a slope across, over, thwart. Koch suggests a formation on Old Norse aska. Diefenbach compares Jutlandish adskans, West Frisian skan, skean, which he connects with Dutch, squeen, squints. There is a whole group of words of more or less obscure origin in aske something, containing askance, askant, askew, aski, askyle, askoy, askoin, which are more or less closely connected in sense and seem to have influenced one another in form. They appear mostly in the 16th or end of the 15th century, and none of them can be certainly traced up to Old English, though they can nearly all be paralleled by words in various languages. Very interesting that this word appears from somewhere outside of English, but one can't even assign it a definite origin in any particular foreign language. Excuse me. So not passing down the direct line from Old English, but colliding sidewise or askant with early modern English, whether coming from Italy, from the Netherlands, or from the far north, the word askance gets its force of meaning from a whole group of words of more or less obscure origin and undefined meaning, continuing to slide along from the point of impact into the domain of the figurative. The dictionary editors continue. In the figurative phrases, to look, eye, view, askance, the idea expressed has varied considerably, different writers using them to indicate disdain, envy, jealousy, and suspicion. The last of these is now the prevalent idea. Well, if the idea expressed has varied so considerably, it may be a fair bet that no one using the word askance, not even John Milton, had a particularly clear sense of what it means, except that it denotes an orientation somehow distorted, perverted, and devalued as distinguished from what is direct and upright. The word's history looks to be an example of lexical indiscriminateness. A word of uncertain provenance comes into the language, is used in a number of vague and possibly mutually inconsistent senses by authors who may have had another word in mind. In other words, it exemplifies the behavior that I see as running contrary to the idea of translation as a substitution of one previously known meaning for another. Sometimes substitutes fail us. Let us suppose that we are translating a text from language A to language B, whatever languages you like. Sooner or later, a word will come up that refers to a particular circumstance of the climate, flora, fauna, customs, or arts of country A, for which no precise equivalent in country B suggests itself. And this is the case where one says, that thing they call sherbet, or amak, or kismet, or sharawaji. Then one goes and explains the thing that has just been named by its foreign name, its name in language A. It is always possible, I hold, to explain sherbet, sharawaji, or schadenfreude. That is how we honor the principle of mutual intelligibility. But in so doing, we mark the foreign thing with a name that does not come from language B, the language in which we're doing the explaining, but rather reproduce a name from language A. We thereby transcribe. We become mimics. If the foreign word subsequently takes, if it becomes the word in language B for the item that we were trying to translate from language A, we speak of it as a loan word, right? I think by now everybody admits that Schadenfreude is a loan word in English. You don't have to study German to use the word Schadenfreude. Now, the term loan word is significant because it's a bit of a lie. If you loan me an object, sooner or later I have to give it back to you, right? But we've been using sherbet since the Middle Ages, amak since 1642, sharawaji since 1685, kaolin since 1741, and show no signs of intending to return them to the speakers of Farsi, Malay, or Chinese. The feeling that the word is not completely ours, that it belongs somewhere else, makes us call it apologetically a borrowing, though in fact we snatched it and mean to keep it. To tell the truth, we couldn't do without these words now. Now, all languages are packed with loan words. Much of what is not loan words in a language is calques, that is, formations of native words used to imitate a foreign word. Interactive, a word somewhat overused these days, was coined around 1830 in imitation of a German term, Wechselwirkung. Translation was coined in ancient Rome to imitate the word in Greek metaphora. And who knows how Wechselwirkung and metaphora arose, possibly as calques on a precedent term that we've lost track of. As long as it is still recognizable as such, the loan word is mildly shocking. It sticks out like a sore thumb, an italicized word, or a new penny. By the way, loan word, something that raises no attention or hackles, is itself a loan word. Right? Lehnwort is used commonly in German decades before people are using loan word in English. But take, for example, the telephone in China. One object among hundreds described in Lydia Liu's Chronicle of the Translingual Practices of Modern Chinese Writing, which we were discussing in Jin's class today. When this object was new and began to be used in the international districts of Shanghai, some people referred to it as the Delufeng. From the sound of Delufeng, I assume that the original use was French. Right? It sounds a little bit more like téléphone to me than telephone. But no matter. It was definitely foreign, as you can see from the 3-character structure, which is not very common in Chinese, and the fact that the word sequence is semantically absurd. If you didn't know what a Delufeng was, how could you guess from hearing it named, as it is in this loan word compound, as a wind of virtuous proportion? Right? That's what rings when somebody is giving you a call. Now, afterwards, or perhaps simultaneously but in a different part of China, someone with a stricter sense of linguistic propriety created another name for the new thing that made it seem as if it had always already had a name in Chinese. Dianhua, electric speech. Dianhua correlates meaningfully with other objects and institutions, such as dianying, electric shadows or cinema, dianbao, electric messenger or telegraph, and so on down the 19th century's list of media discoveries. Dianhua, you could say, translates the telephone, because it's using words that have a previously known meaning, whereas Delufeng transcribes the telephone. Delufeng is macaronic practice, Dianhua is translational practice. Now, Dianhua and Delufeng correspond to 2 profoundly different attitudes about language, about the Chinese language and foreign languages in particular, and about innovation or importation. And Chinese here is strategic for our use just because it makes so obvious what's going on. And also Chinese allows you to play with the situation a little bit more than other languages. It's convenient for our exploration that many 20th century Chinese neologisms exist in both forms, the transliterated foreign word form and the semantically motivated native compound form. There are many cases where you have a Delufeng sort of word and a Dianhua sort of word. Dianhua, the neologism wrought from ancient Chinese roots, thunder or lightning speech, proclaims the readiness of Chinese to make room for all kinds of new things, as if they had been there all along and just needed to be noticed to acquire a name. The exotic ring of the Delufeng, on the other hand, accuses the Chinese language of incompleteness, asserts that there is no way to name this new thing without taking out a foreign loan. Loan words are an opposite to translation in the following sense. With translation, interpretation always precedes the restatement. But with loan words, incorporation of the word in the language occurs without interpretation. Translation works out what the meaning of the foreign text is, then elaborates a corresponding set of meanings that will suitably address the speakers of the target language. With transliteration, on the other hand, foreigners are putting words in your mouth. As often as not, this happens quite literally. Many of the things named with loan words are things you put in your mouth. Asapiling, or aspirin, for example. Someone could have, and someone did, create a phrase like jutongyao, the medicine that stops pain, right? That's a motivated compound. Or someone could have given a chemical definition of acetyl salicylic acid, for which there is certainly a name in Chinese, but I don't know it. But asapiling, like aspirin, denotes a brand name, not a category of results. It comes in a package and it has a seal on it. One must insist on the packing and the seal because they materialize the mysterious character of the classic loan word. The fact that when you handle one, you never quite know what the contents are, but simply convey it as a lump or unit. There is no knowledge to be derived from the a, si, pi, and ling of asapiling if you take them singly. But contrast jutongyao. With jutongyao, you know immediately what kind of product it is and what it does. Presumably, people dislike handling mysterious packages of unknown origin. They also have trouble remembering them. So in Chinese, many loan words have been devised so as to carry along with them a subsequent interpretation. The borrowing was incorporation with no interpretation, pure mimicry, as when English speakers imitated the sounds of amok, catch-up, kayak, or samurai. But the Chinese language, where every written character has at least a vestigial meaning, allows this mimicry to be doubled with an appearance of sense, so that vitamins, vitamin, suggests that they have the function of guarding others' life. Or Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola, tells you that it can be mouthed, can be enjoyed. As these examples indicate, the semantic supplement added to the pure loanword is mostly in the nature of advertising and not always to be believed. This is not precisely translation, but a technique of borrowing that is cleverly adapted to the context of the arrival point. We should refine our initial formulation then. It is not so much incorporation without interpretation, but incorporation separated from interpretation. The interpretation comes after the incorporation and is optional or even poetic. Nonetheless, the fact that incorporation can be separated from interpretation installs a strangeness in language, a zone of macaronic vocabulary where the mouth acts independently of the mind and where the native speaker and native competency are no longer in command. In such situations, the wholesale use of loan words and alien constructions is sure to provoke anxiety about purity. Speakers of the language as it used to be feel that it is being adulterated. And the French, of course, are extremely sensitive about this, right? They have a whole commission that exists to prohibit people from using words, like, I don't know, sandwich or whatnot, Well, sandwich is it's already too late for sandwich, but, other things, right? Le software, you're not supposed to say software, you're supposed to say le logiciel, and so on. Right, so they have an acute sense of the purity of the language. So speakers of the language as it used to be feel that it is being adulterated. Samuel Johnson, joining, as he so often does, clarity of insight with dogged defense of dubious principles, gave memorable voice to this sentiment in the preface to his 1754 dictionary. And I wish I could do a Samuel Johnson voice, but I can't. All right.
Let's do it.
The great pest of speech is frequency of translation. No book was ever turned from one language into another without imparting something of its native idiom. This is the most mischievous and comprehensive innovation. Single words may enter by thousands, and the fabric of the tongue continue the same. But new phraseology changes much at once. It alters not the single stones of the building, but the order of the columns. If an academy should be established for the cultivation of our style, let them, instead of compiling grammars and dictionaries, endeavor, with all their influence, to stop the license of translators, whose idleness and ignorance, if it be suffered to proceed, will reduce us to babble a dialect of France.
Here.
There you have the fear of the macaronic expressed in the most uncompromising terms. What Johnson is responding to here is the traces of the original signifiers that cling to even the most domesticating translations. Did I say a signifier? Uh-oh. A case in point, right? And with the passage of time, make themselves at home. He's noticing, that is, a faint trace of transliteration in translation and demanding that it be kept out by restricting translations altogether. As if in response to such nativist sentiment, other translations do their best to cover their tracks and replace the obvious foreign loans with back formations using the native vocabulary. So it may seem that transliteration is a stage on the way to translation, that the process is meant to result in a natively rooted new word signaling the successful adoption of a foreign thing or concept. Dolufeng would be just a stage on the way to Dianhua. And in fact, historically, nobody says Dolufeng anymore. You would be very quaint if you did that. Everyone says Dianhua. But sometimes the paraphrase comes before the mimicry. Sometimes mimicry is brought in to replace an existing and well-received paraphrase. In the history of long-term linguistic and cultural relationships, we see waverings between the appropriative modes of translation and transliteration. The deciding factor seems to be prestige, or where semantic authority or semantic suspicion is to be found. The more interesting cases of hybrid writing, that is, translation mixed with transliteration, come about when the less well-known language is considered to have some precious resource that one's own language does not yet have, and the hybridity is meant to make it possible to acquire it. Hybrid languages are born of migration and contact, sometimes migration of ideas, sometimes migration of people. And we could, I think, usefully think of English, say, as containing many, many dialects. There would be the dialect of philosophers, for example, which includes a lot of calques and phrases borrowed from German in particular and other languages that only philosophers really wield idiomatically. Right? That's a part of English that's somehow obeying a different set of gravitational laws. Creole languages are said to derive their lexical store from one language and their grammatical articulations from another. That is, Creole languages don't really translate, but they migrate source languages to a new target language. But as Salikoko Mufwene has pointed out, there is no structural criterion specific to Creole languages. What makes it a language Creole, if we're even going to maintain the term, is not its structure, but historical relations to one or more predecessor languages, a relation of cutting and pasting that's still visible in linguistic history. The development of Creoles is an extension of the dynamic of transliteration and not of translation, despite the fact that Creoles, when they first entered the written record, were usually considered the language of illiterates. Right? This is kind of an interesting point to linger on, right? Haitian Creole was not a written language for several hundred years that people were speaking it, and yet the dynamic by which Haitian Creole emerged is what I'm calling transcription, right? The reproduction of words in language A in the context of language B. So perhaps it's just to be expected that a hybrid language like Creole will frustrate ready-made categories. Now, what are the implications of this typology that I've been sketching out of differences between transliteration and translation, or macaronic and translation? You know, because it's nice to observe all these funny little facts, but we shouldn't just be stamp collecting. We should be trying to form some kind of larger pattern. Well, Creole languages, and macaronic generally, remind us forcefully that translation is not the only way that two languages can be in contact. Transliteration runs throughout all languages and deserves our attention as an independent dynamic. If it can be said that languages evolve, then the incorporation of foreign verbal matter, again, Schadenfreude can be my example, must be essential to the process. Because translation, in the traditional sense of the word, only rearranges pre-existing elements of language, but doesn't mix the languages. If we're thinking about cultural contact and transfer through the model of translation, as we too often do, then the specific kind of interplay that comes out in transliteration will remain simply invisible. Characteristically, it is when the language of omnipotent, omnivalent translation is most emphatically voiced that the indispensability of transliteration comes to the fore. I mentioned earlier Emily Apter's book, The Translation Zone. That book concludes with a fantasia about digital communication as the ultimate extension of translation, and I want to look at her fantasia with a somewhat skeptical eye. She says, "Now it is becoming clear that digital code holds out the prospect, at least, of translating everything into everything else. A kind of universal cipher or default language of information, digital code will potentially function like a catalytic converter, translating beyond the interlingual and among orders of bios and genos, liquid and solid, music and architecture, natural language and artificial intelligence, language and genes, nature and data, information and capital." Thus far, Emily Apter. Similar extensions of the term translation are also favored by theorists of technology. Lev Manovich remarks of binary code that it serves as a visual Esperanto for word, sound, image, movement, money, every kind of data and difference in the world. I quote Manovich, "In new media lingo, to transcode something is to translate it into another format. The computerization of culture gradually accomplishes similar transcoding in relation to all cultural categories and concepts." Here, then, is translation carried to an extreme, for Esperanto was supposed to be the universal language, the language for which two-way translatability was always guaranteed. You remember McDermott even reached for Esperanto when he was imagining The Last Judgment. But Manovich's metaphor of transcoding as translating, however appealing it may be, is precisely the wrong one, for digital media do not interpret the meaning of the contents they vehicle. Your computer does not understand the Word file you type into it, nor does it express its content to another computer's understanding when you email it to a friend. Rather, it codes the letters and formatting into a sequence of ones and zeros that are then copied onto the hard disk and recopied through instructions onto the other person's computer, then re-represented as letters and formatting. Transliteration again, all the way down. Incorporation with no interpretation. Translating or summarizing content, the kind of thing that happens when somebody recounts a conversation without repeating the content of the conversation, is something else. Media do not deal with content. They vehicle content. They permit it to be packaged. They subject it to algorithms and encoding, but what they deal with is not the semantic content itself. And when we deal with digital media, as with technological objects generally, we do not open up the black box, so to speak, and understand its coding from the inside. Rather, our relation with media is one of quotation, block citation, repetition, and selection of pre-given elements. A digitally mediated message is in Creole to the degree that it is complex and multimedial. I cut and paste, I drop a film clip or a photograph into a PowerPoint presentation. To do this, I do not in the least need to understand the movie camera, the digitization process, the computer program that runs the film clip, or the LCD screen that lights up to display it. Each of these things is, for me, practically speaking, a black box with a button on it and a cable that I can use to connect it to another black box. I can make things happen with black boxes regardless of my subjective incomprehension of the process. But my linking up of my expressive intent with blocked and chunked automatic operations makes me, to some degree, a post-human person, thanks to macaronics and transliteration. Most technology is inscriptional and transcriptional rather than translational. We use translation to talk to other humans because humans are keyed to the meaning-based behaviors that translation can address. Machines, however, simply repeat. When we use loanwords, when we devise creoles, we are acknowledging repetition, inclusion of otherness, of the otherness of a machine in ourselves. What are the consequences of distinguishing transcription from translation, then? Catachresis from metaphor, inscription from internalization, once we think about it in terms of machines. I can think of several ongoing projects in cultural studies that might be modified to the extent that their current shape depends on an application of the translation model. One result would be to reevaluate formalism as a critical term with a history and as a program for future research. Languages packed with loanwords show us forms colliding in new sequences that have not been prepared for in the realm of pre-existing meanings. If referred back to this model, form, that term, would shed its aestheticist connotations, and its Platonic ones as well, and would become the agent of a different story about how artworks intersect with their publics and with one another. A very pragmatic story that's about consequences rather than purposes. If a word is an instrument, literary works produce their content through the action of combinations of forms, after which, perhaps, meanings are attributed to them. I think the kinship with ideas about the performative, about inscription, about historicity should be clear. Formalism in this sense would be a type of semiotic materialism, which is not what people usually mean when they talk about, usually when they criticize someone for being formalistic. Second, Theorists of media like to cite Marshall McLuhan's aphorism that the content of a new medium is an old medium. For example, early cinema tried to replicate the look and feel of stage plays until people realized that they were making movies and not simply recording stage plays. If we consider the content of the old medium as, the content of the new medium as the old medium, this amounts to seeing the new medium as the translation or the equivalent of the old one. What if we were to insist on the incipient Creole character of the new media product? To continue with our example, how does live theater deform and constrain the pure possibility of cinema? It is traditional to consider this a transitional phase of growth, after which cinema gradually discovers its own potentials and leaves stage acting behind. Right? People discover that they can do things like close-ups or traveling or intercutting, things that you can't do on the stage, and then cinema really blossoms and comes into its own. What if cinema were to be thought of as remaining to the end of its days an unstable compound of technological artifact and stage representation, with stage representation itself an unstable compound of earlier genres, and so forth? I'm trying to argue against a persuasive theory of modernism that has been with us since Roman Jakobson in the 20s or Clement Greenberg in the 40s that says that modernism is what happens when a medium discovers its own expressive properties, when painting becomes really and truly painting and stops trying to be poetry or whatever. And poetry says, poetry is purely linguistic and not this or that. I'm trying to argue against that line of argument and say that perhaps a medium discovers the properties that are, quote, its own, only through contact with what is not itself. Right? That would be the logical consequence of adopting a transliteration format for cultural analysis. Finally, the interpretative cast of the humanities would come under suspicion, because that is inextricably linked to the model that I'm calling translation, semantic translation. And it's not so easily brought into relation with what I'm calling incorporation or mimicry. About 150 years ago, Vilhelm Dilt offered a kind of charter for the humanities, sensing that the new set of disciplines centered around experiment, technological innovation, and practical applications, that is, the hard sciences, were crowding the humanities out of the German universities. So in order to protect his turf, Dilt contended that the sciences and the humanities have different tasks. The sciences explain, but the humanities interpret. And they do this, they interpret, according to Dilt, by using the individual scholar's mind as a kind of a transference apparatus. The natural sciences deal with what always happens. The humanities deal with what might happen in the realm of freedom, with a set of alternatives. And in order to understand a document composed by an earlier human being, says Dilt, we have to live through the process of choices that earlier human being must have made in order to compose that document. Right? It's a kind of a sympathetic identification with the past. That realization alone makes it possible for us to understand an earlier document. Now, Dilt was correct, I think, in trying to distinguish the modes of reasoning in the natural sciences and the humanities. They don't benefit from being clumped into the same category. But I would still like to draw a line around this domain of translation and to show that this idea of intersubjective understanding is entirely within the realm of meanings and translations. What would the alternative be? Well, the difference between a humanities of interpretation in the style of Dilt and a sort of a de-humanities, an inhumanities, such as you find in the media theories of people like Friedrich Kittler or Donna Haraway or Bernhard Stiegler, is an effect of the transcriptional dynamic that's espoused by the latter. Right? Those people are very invested in the centrality of objects rather than people. They're interested in technical determinism, which they use as a kind of a corrective for human-centered theories that humans like. And they're also interested in temporal discontinuity. Right? An invention sort of creates a crack in history. And the way that they write sometimes gives us the impression that it's meant to be read with appreciation by a human-machine hybrid. All right, but that's the price of their particular kind of innovation. So you see, I think there are some fairly big consequences to considering transcription or mimicry or macaronic as the motor of linguistic and cultural change, and maybe to adopting it for some methods with which we can scrutinize humanities texts. More broadly, to relegate translation to a secondary position behind transcription, that would be the really ambitious version. You see, earlier I was trying to sneak my way into your minds and say, actually, it's an alternative. Not everything is translation, but the ambitious version of this would be to say, let's make transcription the primary thing and translation the secondary thing. I don't know if I'll ever get there, but let's entertain the hypothesis for a minute. To put transcription first would be to make the signifier the active and primary bearer of artistic energy, not the passive and secondary one. As McDermott said in the poem we read, it's sound, not sense, that fathoms the hearts of men. The argument is that cultural forms exist not to express our thoughts, but to help us discover our thoughts. Our forms then become valuable since we no longer see them as mere vehicles for transmitting what is already known. I have a kind of an everyday analogy for this. If you have an iPod, it will tell you what your favorite song is, right? You probably thought that such and such is your favorite song. If I asked you what is your favorite song, you would say, blah, blah. But look at your iPod. The song that you've played most often over the last 2.5 years is not X, but Y, right? So your iPod helps you discover something that you didn't know about yourself. That's the effect that I'm looking for here from all kinds of artworks, not simply Apple products. Thank you, Steve Jobs. The avant-garde artistic movements of the 20th century dislocated traditional modes of representation for precisely this reason. I think to force us into a recognition of things that we didn't know about ourselves and maybe didn't want to know. And I think contemporary scholarship in language and literature would benefit from following the example of the avant-gardes. Though by that I don't mean stalwartly repeating what the artists, composers, painters, and writers of the period 1900 to 1930 already did. What transcription can do when enlarged to the scope of a method is to teach us new ways of behaving with signs that ought to leave us at odds with or askance from our former selves. That would be the program. Thank you very much.